The courtroom was silent, save for the rhythmic tapping of Judge Amina Porter's fingers against the oak desk. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned the room, settling briefly on the defendant, a middle-aged man with a face weathered like a crumpled paper bag. The air was thick with tension, though no one dared to speak. Amina's reputation was ironclad. She was the kind of judge who commanded respect the moment she entered the room. But that day, something felt different. It wasn't just the case, a convoluted embezzlement trial, but the way the man on the stand sneered at her as if he had already won. "I don't take orders from people like you," he spat, venom dripping from every word. The phrase lingered, toxic and undeniable. The court clerk coughed, an awkward attempt to dissipate the heavy silence. Amina didn't flinch, didn't even blink. She leaned back in her chair, her expression a mask of calm. But inside, she felt the familiar coil of anger, the kind that came from years of facing subtle and overt racism in a career that demanded restraint at all costs. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was steady. "Mr. Kellerman, you're here to answer for your actions, not to insult this court. Do I make myself clear?" Kellerman smirked, leaning casually against the witness stand. His lawyer, a younger man with perpetually damp palms, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The tension in the room crackled like a live wire. Amina's composure was her weapon. She knew better than to react emotionally. But today, the insult felt personal, like it had been aimed not just at her role as a judge, but at her very existence. Still, she proceeded, her tone clipped and professional. "Let's continue." After the day's session, Amina stayed late, poring over case files in her chambers. The insult played on a loop in her mind, growing louder as the hours ticked by. She tried to focus on the task at hand, but her thoughts were scattered. The sharp edges of Kellerman's words had cut deeper than she cared to admit. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. It was Jacob, her bailiff and longtime confidant. "You all right, Judge Porter?" he asked, his voice tinged with concern. Amina hesitated before nodding. "Fine. Just a long day." Jacob stepped closer, lowering his voice. "That guy today, don't let him get under your skin. He wants a reaction." Amina managed a small smile. "I know, but thanks." As Jacob left, Amina leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. Her mind wandered, fragments of memory surfacing like debris in a storm. She thought of her father's words when she first told him she wanted to be a judge. "You'll have to be twice as good, Amina, twice as strong." That night, she dreamed of an old house, one she hadn't seen in years. It was the house she'd grown up in, with its peeling paint and creaky floors. In the dream, she was a child again, standing in the front yard as a storm rolled in. The sky was a bruise of purple and gray, and the wind carried whispers she couldn't quite make out. When she woke, the dream lingered, its meaning just out of reach. The clock on her bedside table read 3:47 a.m. She got up and went to the kitchen, pouring herself a glass of water. The apartment was quiet, but the city outside buzzed with life: sirens, car horns, the hum of electricity. As she stared out the window, a sense of unease settled over her. She couldn't shake the feeling that the storm from her dream wasn't just a memory. It was a warning. The next day, the courtroom was packed again, the case drawing more attention than expected. Amina took her seat, her gaze sweeping over the room. But something was off. She noticed it immediately, the way people avoided her eyes, the way conversations hushed as she entered. She soon discovered why. A video had surfaced online, taken during the previous day's session. It showed Kellerman's outburst, followed by a heavily edited clip of Amina's reaction, or lack thereof. The caption read, "This judge lets criminals insult her to her face. Is she fit for the bench?" The comments were worse. Amina read them in silence, her stomach turning with each word. This is what happens when you let adversity ruin the justice system. Typical. Can't handle the heat. She should step down before she embarrasses herself further. The courtroom seemed calmer the next day, as though the air had settled after Kellerman's vile outburst. Judge Amina Porter walked in with her head held high, her robe billowing behind her like a shield. The murmurs in the gallery quieted instantly at her arrival, replaced by the shuffle of papers and the faint hum of fluorescent lights. She began the session with a measured tone, her voice steady and authoritative. The motions and testimonies passed without incident, giving Amina the brief but comforting illusion that order had been restored. Yet, beneath the surface, something about the proceedings felt off. She couldn't put her finger on it, but there was a lingering tension in the air, like a violin string pulled too tight. During a recess, Amina retreated to her chambers. Her assistant, Caroline, followed close behind, balancing a tray with coffee and a stack of correspondence. Caroline was young and eager, the kind of person who took meticulous notes during every meeting. "I sorted through the mail for you, Judge," Caroline said, setting the tray on the desk. "But there's something I think you should see." She handed Amina an envelope. It was plain, unmarked, and sealed with care. Amina opened it cautiously, pulling out a single sheet of paper. The words, written in blocky black letters, were simple but chilling. "You don't belong here. Leave while you can." Amina's hand tightened around the paper, but her expression didn't falter. She'd seen notes like this before, each one a bitter reminder of the prejudice that had followed her throughout her career. Still, something about this one felt different, more personal. "Do we need to alert security?" Caroline asked, her voice tinged with worry. "No," Amina said after a pause. "It's just noise. People like this thrive on attention." Caroline nodded, but her frown lingered. "If you're sure." As the day went on, Amina found herself replaying the moment in her mind. The note, combined with the online backlash from the video, felt like a coordinated attack. But who was behind it? She scanned the faces in the courtroom, searching for answers in every sidelong glance and whispered conversation. Kellerman, of course, was the obvious suspect. He sat at the defendant's table, his posture relaxed, as if the weight of his trial didn't concern him. His smirk had returned, and every so often, his gaze would flicker toward Amina, his expression unreadable. But there were others who gave her pause, like Martin Spencer, the prosecutor, whose affable demeanor often seemed too polished, or even the court stenographer, who avoided eye contact more than usual. Paranoia gnawed at the edges of Amina's mind, but she pushed it aside. She couldn't afford to lose focus. That evening, Amina attended a charity gala hosted by the city's legal community. The event was a chance to network, raise funds, and remind the public of the justice system's humanity. Amina didn't want to go. She rarely enjoyed these gatherings, but Jacob had convinced her. "You need to show them you're unshaken," he'd said earlier that day. "Let them see you're still standing tall." The gala was held in an opulent ballroom, its crystal chandeliers casting a golden glow over the sea of well-dressed attendees. Amina wore a deep emerald dress, her usual robes replaced by elegance. As she moved through the crowd, she exchanged polite smiles and handshakes, her practiced charisma shielding her from prying questions. "Judge Porter," a familiar voice called out. Amina turned to see Spencer, the prosecutor from Kellerman's trial. He held a glass of champagne, his tie slightly loosened. "Mr. Spencer," Amina greeted, her tone neutral. "Enjoying the evening?" "As much as one can," he replied with a chuckle. "Though I imagine you could use a break from all the courtroom drama." Amina raised an eyebrow. "It's part of the job." "True, true." Spencer sipped his drink, then leaned in slightly. "But between us, that Kellerman case is a mess. I wouldn't blame you if you wanted to expedite things." Amina's gaze hardened. "Justice isn't something we expedite, Mr. Spencer." Spencer held up his hands in mock surrender. "Fair enough, just trying to make conversation." As he walked away, Amina felt a flicker of unease. There was something about his tone, too casual, too knowing, that didn't sit right. She brushed the thought aside, forcing herself to focus on the rest of the evening. Later, as she was leaving the gala, Amina received a text from an unknown number. It read, "You look lovely tonight. Shame about the company you keep." Her blood ran cold. She glanced around the parking lot, her eyes scanning for anyone suspicious. But the area was nearly empty, the distant hum of traffic the only sound. When she got home, she double-checked every lock and window before finally sitting down in her living room. The text felt like another piece of a puzzle she couldn't yet see. Someone was watching her, closer than she realized. The next morning, the courtroom was abuzz with whispers. Amina stepped in, her presence silencing the room as usual. But as the day unfolded, the facade of stability began to crack. First, one of Kellerman's witnesses recanted their statement, claiming they'd been coerced. Then, a key piece of evidence disappeared, leaving both the defense and prosecution scrambling. Amina tried to maintain control, but the disruptions piled up, each one eroding the fragile sense of order she tried to preserve. By the end of the day, Amina was exhausted. As she packed up her things, Jacob appeared at her door. "You all right?" he asked. "No," Amina admitted. "Something's happening, Jacob. I don't know what, but it's bigger than this case." Jacob nodded, his expression grim. "You think someone's targeting you?" "Maybe. Or maybe I'm just seeing shadows where there aren't any." Jacob frowned. "I don't think you are." As Amina left the courthouse, the weight of her suspicions grew heavier. She had allies, but how many of them could she truly trust? And more importantly, how long would the illusion of security hold before everything came crashing down? The courtroom had become a theater of uncertainty, each player moving in ways that felt both deliberate and unpredictable. Judge Amina Porter, usually poised and unshakable, felt the cracks forming beneath her polished exterior. Every detail, every glance, every whispered exchange carried new weight. She was being watched. That much she knew, but by whom and to what end remained elusive. The turning point came late on a Wednesday afternoon. The courthouse was nearly empty, the echo of her heels the only sound as she walked to her chambers. Jacob was waiting for her, leaning casually against her desk, a rare frown pulling at his usually calm face. "What is it?" Amina asked, setting her briefcase down. "You're not going to like this," Jacob said, handing her a folder. "I found it on my desk this morning. No note, no explanation, just this." Amina opened the folder and froze. Inside were copies of emails, phone records, and a series of photographs. Each piece pointed to a damning connection between Martin Spencer, the prosecutor, and the defendant, Kellerman. Payments exchanged hands, meetings held in shadowy corners of the city. It was a conspiracy laid bare. "This," Amina began, her voice tight. "This is evidence of collusion. Spencer's working with Kellerman." Jacob nodded. "Looks that way. And from what I can tell, it's been going on for months. Spencer's been feeding him intel, making sure the case gets tangled in procedural knots." Amina sank into her chair, the weight of the revelation pressing down on her. This explains so much, the missing evidence, the recanted statements. But how did this end up on your desk? Who sent it? Jacob shrugged. "No idea, but whoever it was wants this out in the open. And if we're not careful, it'll explode in our faces." The next day, Amina entered the courtroom with renewed determination. She had already contacted Internal Affairs to investigate Spencer, though she kept the details to herself. Trust was a luxury she could no longer afford. As the session progressed, Spencer seemed uncharacteristically nervous. He fumbled through his arguments, his usual charm replaced by a forced stiffness. Amina watched him closely, her instincts on high alert. During a brief recess, she called Spencer into her chambers. He arrived looking wary, his eyes darting around the room as though searching for an escape route. "Sit," Amina said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. Spencer obeyed, his movements stiff. "What's this about, Judge Porter?" Amina leaned forward, her gaze piercing. "I know, Martin. About you and Kellerman. The meetings, the payments, everything." Spencer's face went pale. I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't insult my intelligence," Amina snapped. She pulled out the folder Jacob had given her, tossing it onto the desk between them. "This is all the proof I need. You've been sabotaging this case from the inside." Spencer's hands trembled as he flipped through the contents of the folder. For a moment, it seemed as though he might deny it again, but then his shoulders sagged. "It wasn't supposed to go this far," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "What wasn't?" Amina demanded. "What are you trying to protect?" Spencer looked up, his eyes filled with something akin to desperation. You don't understand. Kellerman has connections, powerful ones. They're not just coming after me, they're coming after anyone who gets in their way, including you. The words hit Amina like a physical blow. You're saying this is bigger than the case. Spencer nodded. Much bigger. Kellerman's just the tip of the iceberg. He's a puppet for people who'd rather see you silenced and succeed. That night, Amina sat in her apartment, the city's glow filtering through her window. The weight of Spencer's confession pressed heavily on her. But it was the growing sense of betrayal that cut the deepest. Spencer wasn't just another prosecutor. He'd been a colleague she respected, someone she believed in despite his flaws. And then there was Jacob. Though she trusted him implicitly, the folder's mysterious appearance on his desk gnawed at her. Who had left it there? And why had they chosen Jacob as the messenger? Amina's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. She hesitated before answering, her hand instinctively reaching for her phone. It was Jacob. He stood in the hallway, his face grim. "We need to talk," he said. Amina stepped aside, letting him in. "What is it?" Jacob didn't sit, instead pacing the room like a restless tiger. "I've been digging into the evidence, trying to figure out where it came from. And I found something." He handed her a printout. It was a bank statement, showing a series of transactions linked to an offshore account. The name associated with the accounts stopped Amina cold. "Caroline," she whispered. Jacob nodded. "Your assistant's been working with Spencer. She's been feeding him information, your schedule, your notes, even private conversations." Amina's stomach churned. Caroline, who had always been so eager to help, so loyal, had been playing her all along. The betrayal felt like a knife to the gut. "Why?" Amina asked, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. "Money, probably," Jacob said. "But I think it's more than that. Caroline's name shows up in some of the same circles as Kellerman's associates. She's not just a pawn, she's part of the game." Amina sank into her chair, her mind racing. The web of deceit was far more intricate than she'd imagined. And now, she had no choice but to confront Caroline, to uncover the full extent of her betrayal. The next morning, Amina called Caroline into her chambers. The young assistant entered with her usual chipper demeanor, but Amina could see the flicker of unease in her eyes. "Caroline," Amina began, her tone icy, "close the door." Caroline hesitated before obeying, her hands fidgeting nervously. "Is something wrong, Judge Porter?" "Why don't you tell me?" Amina said, sliding the bank statement across the desk. "Explain this." Caroline's face drained the color. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. "How long?" Amina pressed. "How long have you been working against me?" Caroline's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't have a choice," she stammered. "They threatened my family. If I didn't help, they said they'd save it." Amina snapped. "You betrayed me, Caroline. After everything, you sold me out." "I'm sorry," Caroline whispered, her voice cracking. "I didn't know it would go this far." Amina leaned back, the weight of the betrayal crushing her. "You're done here," she said. "Effective immediately. And if I find out you're withholding anything, you'll face the full weight of the law." Caroline nodded, tears streaming down her face. She turned and left, the door closing with a final, resounding click. Alone in her chambers, Amina stared at the empty chair across from her. The storm she dreamed of was here, and it was far worse than she'd imagined. The people she trusted were either complicit or powerless to stop it. The courtroom, once a symbol of order and justice, had become a battlefield of hidden agendas and manipulation. Judge Amina Porter sat at the bench, outwardly composed, but her mind was a storm of doubt and anger. The betrayals of Spencer and Caroline had cracked the foundation of her trust, leaving her questioning everything. The case against Kellerman dragged on, each session revealing new inconsistencies. Witnesses faltered, evidence surfaced and disappeared, and the media's scrutiny amplified. Amina felt like a marionette, each string tugged by unseen hands. She was losing control, and she hated it. In her chambers, Amina pored over the mounting pile of documents, trying to find a thread to pull, a truth buried beneath the lies. The air was heavy with tension, her once pristine desk now cluttered with papers, coffee cups, and frayed sticky notes. Jacob stood by the door, arms crossed, his face lined with concern. "You can't keep doing this," he said quietly. "You're running yourself into the ground." "I don't have a choice," Amina replied, her voice sharp. "Every time I think I'm getting closer, something new falls apart. This case is a labyrinth, and I can't see the way out." Jacob hesitated before speaking again. What if the way out isn't through the case? What if it's about stepping back and looking at the bigger picture? Amina's eyes narrowed. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying this isn't just about Kellerman. It's about who put him in that courtroom, who's pulling the strings. You're fighting a war, Amina, not a trial." His words lingered in the air like smoke, and Amina knew he was right. She wasn't just dealing with a corrupt prosecutor or a compromised assistant. This was systemic, a network of power and influence designed to protect itself at all costs. The tipping point came during a key witness's testimony. David Conrad, an accountant who had worked under Kellerman, took the stand to detail his involvement in the embezzlement scheme. He was nervous, his hands trembling as he spoke, but his words were damning. "Mr. Kellerman instructed me to falsify records and divert funds to offshore accounts," Conrad said. "He promised I'd be protected if anyone ever found out." The courtroom was silent, every word hanging in the air. But as the cross-examination began, Spencer's demeanor shifted. He questioned Conrad with a ferocity that bordered on aggression, poking holes in his testimony with surgical precision. Amina watched, unease growing in her chest. Spencer was too good at this, too prepared. It wasn't just about discrediting Conrad, it was about dismantling the entire case. When court adjourned, Amina called for a private meeting with Spencer. He arrived looking smug, his confidence restored. "You overstepped today," she said, her tone cold. "Just doing my job," Spencer replied, feigning innocence. "Your job is to seek justice, not destroy it," Amina snapped. "You're working against the truth, and I will not stand for it." Spencer's smile faltered, but only briefly. "Be careful, Judge Porter. You're making accusations without proof. That's a dangerous game." As he left, Amina felt the weight of his warning. The lines between ally and enemy had blurred, and she was no longer certain whom she could trust. That evening, Amina sat in her apartment, staring at the documents spread across her coffee table. Every piece of evidence, every testimony, every name, it all felt connected, like threads in an elaborate web. But the more she tried to untangle it, the more it seemed to tighten around her. She thought of Caroline, her betrayal still a fresh wound. Had she been coerced? Or was her involvement deeper? And what of Jacob, her most trusted confidant? He'd brought her the damning evidence, but where had it come from? Amina's phone buzzed, raking her thoughts. It was a text from an unknown number. "You're looking in the wrong place. The enemy isn't who you think." Her heart pounded as she stared at the message. It was cryptic, but it confirmed what she'd feared. There were more layers to this than she'd realized. The next morning, Amina decided to confront Jacob. She needed answers, and she needed them now. "Where did the folder come from?" she demanded, shutting the door to her chambers behind her. Jacob looked taken aback. "I told you it was on my desk. And you didn't question it." Amina pressed. "You didn't think to find out who left it or why." Jacob sighed, running a hand over his face. "I didn't want to drag you into something bigger than you already were. But, yeah, I had suspicions." "Of what?" Jacob hesitated. "There's someone inside the courthouse, someone high up, feeding information to Kellerman's people. I didn't want to say anything without proof, but I think that someone wanted you to have that folder. They're playing both sides." Amina's stomach turned. "Who?" Jacob's expression darkened. "I don't know, but whoever it is, they've got connections everywhere." The tension came to a head during the next session. Amina was halfway through her ruling on a motion when the courtroom doors burst open. Two men in dark suits entered, their badges flashing. "Judge Porter," one of them said, his voice cutting through the room. "We're here on behalf of the State Attorney General's office. You're being investigated for judicial misconduct." The room erupted into chaos. Amina stood frozen, her mind racing. "On what grounds?" she demanded, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. The man handed her a document. A series of anonymous complaints have been filed against you, alleging bias and improper conduct in this case. Amina scanned the document, her pulse pounding. The complaints were vague but damning, painting her as a judge who had compromised the integrity of the trial. "This is absurd," she said, her voice rising. "I have upheld the law at every turn." But the men didn't waver. "You'll need to step down pending the investigation." As they escorted her from the courtroom, Amina felt the eyes of the gallery on her, some sympathetic, others smug. Among them, she caught a glimpse of Kellerman, his smirk wider than ever. It was a setup. Every step of the way, she'd been maneuvered into this position. And now, her career and her very integrity was on the line. Back in her chambers, Amina sat alone, the weight of everything crashing down on her. She thought of her father's words. "You'll have to be twice as strong, Amina." But even strength had its limits. For the first time in years, she doubted herself. Had she been too rigid, too blind to the forces working against her? Or had she trusted the wrong people, leaving herself vulnerable to their betrayal? The text from the unknown number echoed in her mind. "The enemy isn't who you think." Amina realized she'd been fighting battles on the surface, while the real war raged beneath. If she was going to uncover the truth, she'd need to go deeper, risk everything, and confront the shadows she'd been avoiding. Her belief in justice had carried her this far, but now she wasn't sure if justice was something she could find, or something she'd have to create. Amina sat in the dimly lit room that had been assigned to her in the interim, while the investigation into her conduct proceeded. Stripped of her courtroom, her robes, and her authority, she felt untethered, but beneath the wariness, a quiet rage burned. She had been outmaneuvered, betrayed by people she trusted, and accused of corruption she'd spent her career fighting. The message from the unknown sender played over and over in her mind. The enemy isn't who you think. That night, she made a decision. If she was going to be dragged down, she'd go down fighting. She'd uncover the truth, even if it meant confronting the darkness within herself. The break came when Jacob handed her a new lead. He'd been quietly investigating Caroline, following the trail of her betrayal. "I found something," Jacob said, sliding a flash drive across the table. "It's encrypted, but I think it's the key to everything. Caroline's been meeting with someone high up." "Who?" Amina demanded. Jacob hesitated, his expression guarded. "You're not going to like it." Amina plugged the drive into her laptop, her fingers trembling. As the files opened, her breath caught in her throat. The name at the top of the documents was someone she never expected. Judge Robert Langston, the presiding judge of the circuit court and her longtime mentor. Langston had been a father figure to Amina, guiding her through the challenges of her early career and encouraging her to take on this high-profile case. To see his name tied to the conspiracy was like a knife to the heart. "This has to be a mistake," Amina said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Langston's always fought for justice. He's one of the good ones." Jacob's expression was grim. "It's no mistake. He's been working with Kellerman's people for years, funneling cases to judges who'll rule in their favor. You were never supposed to be assigned this case, Amina. Langston fought to keep it off your docket, but when he couldn't, he set you up to fail." Amina decided to confront Langston directly. She found him in his office late at night, the air thick with cigar smoke and the faint hum of jazz playing from his old record player. "Judge Porter," Langston said, looking up from his desk. "To what do I owe this unexpected visit?" Amina stepped forward, placing the flash drive on his desk. "You tell me." Langston's expression didn't falter. He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "I see you've been busy." "Busy uncovering the truth," Amina shot back. "How long, Langston? How long have you been betraying the system you claim to protect?" Langston sighed, removing his glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose. "It's not that simple, Amina." "Then explain it to me," she said, her voice trembling with equal parts anger and heartbreak. Langston gestured for her to sit, but she remained standing, her arms crossed. He sighed again, his voice heavy with resignation. "I started this job with the same ideals as you," he began. "Justice, fairness, the belief that the law could change the world. But the system, It's rotten, Amina. It doesn't matter how hard you fight or how much you believe. The ones with power always win. So you gave up? Amina snapped. I adapted, Langston replied. You think Kellerman's the real villain here. He's a symptom, not the disease. The people he works for, they control everything. The courts, the police, the politicians. They made it clear a long time ago that I could either play along or be destroyed. You had a choice, Amina said, her voice breaking. You could have fought back and ended up like the others, Langston countered. Do you know how many good judges have been ruined, disbarred, disgraced, even killed because they refused to play the game? I made a decision to survive, and in doing so, I've been able to protect what little good is left in this system. Amina shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. You're just justifying your cowardice. You betrayed me, Langston. You set me up to fail. I was trying to protect you, Langston said, his voice rising. I knew if you took this case, they'd come after you. And they did, didn't they? I warned you to stay out of this, but you wouldn't listen. You're too stubborn for your own good. That's not protection, Amina said coldly. That's control, and I'm not going to let you manipulate me anymore. Langston leaned forward, his gaze intense. You think you can take them down? You think you're some kind of hero? You're out of your depth, Amina. These people will chew you up and spit you out. They've already started. Amina left Langston's office more determined than ever. His justifications, his excuses, they only fueled her resolve. She wasn't naive about the risks, but she refused to let fear dictate her actions. She spent the next several days compiling everything she learned. The evidence against Kellerman, the corruption within the courthouse, Langston's involvement. It was all connected, and it painted a damning picture of a system rigged against those it claimed to serve. But as she pieced it together, a realization struck her. She wasn't entirely innocent either. She'd been so focused on climbing the ranks, on proving herself in a world that doubted her, that she'd ignored the warning signs. She trusted too easily, been blind to the cracks in the system she believed in. The fight wasn't just against the corruption around her. It was also against the complacency within her. The final confrontation came in a dramatic courtroom showdown. Amina had managed to secure a hearing to present her findings, despite the ongoing investigation against her. The room was packed, tension thick in the air. Spencer, Langston, and even Kellerman were in attendance, their expressions ranging from smug confidence to simmering unease. Amina stood before the gallery, her voice steady and clear. She laid out the evidence with precision, each revelation a hammer blow against the facade of legitimacy. The audience gasped as she exposed Langston's role, Spencer's collusion, and Kellerman's network of influence. But it wasn't enough. As Amina reached the climax of her presentation, the power in the room shifted. Langston stood, his calm demeanor masking the venom in his words. This is nothing more than a desperate attempt by a disgraced judge to save her career, he said, addressing the gallery. Judge Porter has always been ambitious, but ambition without discipline is a dangerous thing. The words stung, but Amina refused to back down. This isn't about me, she said, her voice rising. This is about a system that's been corrupted from the inside out. You can try to discredit me, but the truth will come out. It always does. For a moment, the room was silent. Then Langston spoke again, his voice low and measured. The truth, Judge Porter, is rarely as simple as you think. The fallout was swift and brutal. Langston resigned, but not before ensuring the blame was spread wide enough to protect the system he'd served. Spencer was disbarred, and Kellerman faced new charges, though his connections ensured he'd likely never serve real time. As for Amina, the investigation into her conduct was dropped, but her reputation was irreparably damaged. She was offered a quiet resignation or reassignment to a lower court, an insult she refused to accept. Instead, she chose a different path. She left the bench entirely, dedicating herself to fighting the corruption from the outside. Her final words to Langston echoed in her mind as she packed her office. The truth will come out. It always does. But deep down, Amina knew the truth was far more complicated. The fight for justice wasn't a battle to be won, but a war to be endured. And she was ready to endure it, no matter the cost. As she walked out of the courthouse for the last time, a single question lingered in her mind. In a world where everyone is compromised, can true justice ever exist? Amina Porter stood at the courthouse steps, her silhouette framed by the dim, gray light of an overcast sky. Behind her lay years of dedication to justice, now tarnished, abandoned. Ahead was a path uncertain, a future untethered to the identity she'd spent her life cultivating. The fallout from her revelations had been seismic, shaking the courthouse to its core. Langston's resignation made headlines, though the media painted him as a tragic figure, a man forced into moral compromises by a system larger than himself. Spencer's disbarment was a fleeting story, overshadowed by larger scandals. As for Kellerman, he was convicted on lesser charges, a slap on the wrist compared to the weight of his crimes. For Amina, there had been no victory, only survival. She spent the following weeks in relative isolation, refusing interviews and ignoring the barrage of public opinion. The world, it seemed, had moved on, leaving her to grapple with the emptiness of what she'd uncovered. One evening, Jacob visited her apartment, a bottle of wine in hand. "You've been quiet," he said, settling into her worn armchair. "Nothing left to say," Amina replied, pouring 2 glasses. Jacob leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "You brought down Langston, exposed the network. That's not nothing." "It feels like nothing," she said, her voice low. Langston walked away with his dignity intact. Kellerman's still connected, and the system. It's the same as it's always been. Jacob studied her for a moment. "You expected to change everything overnight." Amina sighed. "I expected it to matter. But now, I don't know. Maybe Langston was right. Maybe the system is too big, too corrupt to fix." Jacob raised his glass. "Maybe it is, but that doesn't mean you stop trying." As the weeks turned into months, Amina began piecing together a new purpose. She took on pro bono cases, working with grassroots organizations to provide legal aid to marginalized communities. It wasn't the grand stage of the courtroom, but it felt real, personal. One case, in particular, stayed with her. A young woman named Tasha, falsely accused of theft by a wealthy employer. The evidence against Tasha was circumstantial at best, but the system had moved swiftly, eager to make an example of her. Amina threw herself into the case, uncovering a pattern of abuse and exploitation by the employer. By the time the trial concluded, Tasha had been exonerated, and the employer faced a civil suit. "You saved my life," Tasha said tearfully as they left the courthouse. Amina shook her head. "You saved yourself. I just helped." But as she watched Tasha reunite with her family, Amina felt something stir within her, a spark of the idealism she thought she'd lost. One rainy afternoon, Amina found herself back at the courthouse. The grand facade loomed before her, a monument to a system she no longer trusted. She wasn't sure why she'd come, but something about the place still called to her. Inside, she ran into Langston in the hallway. He looked older, his shoulders stooped, the weight of his choices evident in his eyes. "Amina," he said, his tone cautious. "Judge Langston," she replied, her voice cold. They stood in silence for a moment before Langston spoke again. "I heard about the work you're doing. It suits you." Amina folded her arms. "Why?" "Because it's small enough not to threaten the system." Langston flinched but held her gaze. "Because it's where real change starts. One case, one life at a time." She shook her head. "You don't get to lecture me about change. Not after what you've done." Langston sighed. "I never said I was proud of my choices, but I made them because I believed it was the only way to survive. You've chosen a different path, and for what it's worth, I respect that." Amina narrowed her eyes. "I didn't choose it. The system chose for me when it pushed me out." Langston gave a small, bitter smile. "Then maybe being pushed out was the best thing that could have happened to you." That night, Amina replayed Langston's words in her mind. She hated to admit it, but he wasn't entirely wrong. Outside the system, she found a freedom she hadn't realized she needed. But the freedom came with a cost, the weight of knowing the system remained unchanged, its corruption unchecked. She thought of Tasha and the countless others like her, people who'd been crushed by the same system Amina had once believed in. Her victories felt small against the scale of the injustice, but they were victories nonetheless. Months later, Amina received an unexpected envelope in the mail. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a court docket listing Kellerman's upcoming appeal. At the bottom, scrawled in familiar handwriting, were the words, "They're still watching. Be careful." There was no signature, but Amina didn't need one to know who'd sent it. Langston, ever the pragmatist, still had his ways of warning her. She stared at the paper, the weight of its implications pressing down on her. The network she'd exposed wasn't dismantled. It was regrouping, preparing for its next move. For a moment, she considered walking away. She could continue her work outside the system, avoiding the risks and dangers of confronting it head-on. But then she thought of her father's words. "You'll have to be twice as strong, Amina." She folded the paper and placed it in her drawer, a quiet resolve settling over her. As the first rays of dawn broke through her window, Amina sat at her desk, poring over case files. The system might be broken, but she wasn't. Not yet. She knew the fight would be long, the victories fleeting, the losses devastating. But she also knew that every small act of justice mattered. And as the sun rose higher, Amina allowed herself a rare smile. Justice wasn't a destination, it was a journey. And she was ready to keep walking, no matter where it led. Final line. In a world where the lines between hero and villain blur, is true justice ever possible? Or is it only an illusion we fight to preserve?